Mama didn't raise no slime.
Okay, be ready, Mario. This triple ricochet is a 1 in a million shot. It'll either drive that ghost from Luigi's body, or it'll turn him into a drooling, moronic zombie forever.
You're just a
For 2 consecutive console generations, Nintendo maintained its reputation as the undisputed champion of the industry. At the height of its initial popularity, the video game market peaked at $3 billion, before crashing to $100 million. Something about an oversaturated market, there was an ET game on Atari, nearly 800,000 cartridges buried in the New Mexico desert. Anyways, many consumers believed electronic video games to be a passing fad. By the time the Nintendo Entertainment System landed on store shelves, it sat smack dab in the middle of the boys' toy aisle. Nintendo's marketing made sure to steer clear from explicitly mentioning the VG word, instead choosing to market itself as a toy right out of the gate. The first televised commercial introducing the NES opened not with Super Mario Bros., but Rob the Robot, the beloved character from Super Smash Bros. Brawl, a title that would be released 23 years later. A bold move, but one that paid off tremendously.
Comes with Rob, Zapper, Control Deck, 2 controllers, Gyromite, and Duck Hunt.
Nintendo single-handedly revitalized interest in the video game market. By 1987, the industry returned to $1.1 billion in profit, and of that billion, Nintendo's share was 70%. By the time the Super Nintendo rolled out, the industry grew by $3.6 billion, and Nintendo controlled more than 85% of the market. All of this begs the question, how did Sony's PlayStation manage to dethrone Nintendo's monopoly over the industry?
Hey, plumber boy, mustache man, your worst nightmare has arrived. Pack up your stuff!
In the 90s, Sony was a well-established electronics manufacturer, so a console of their own wasn't out of the question. A few years earlier, they co-developed a CD add-on for the SNES, but when their relationship with Nintendo turned sour, Sony decided to venture forth into the industry, solo. Sony's PlayStation launched an entire year ahead of Nintendo's 64-bit system. Their only competition was the Sega Saturn and 3DO. Sega basically shit the bed when they announced their console's price tag, and the 3DO was the 3DO. By the time the Nintendo 64 landed on store shelves, Sony had over 100 titles released, while Nintendo had titles like Pilot Wings and Super Mario 64.
You could zoom in, zoom out, change angles. Go anywhere you want to go, do anything you want to do. Here we go!
Marketing would lead you to believe that Mario 64 laid the groundwork for 3D games. And aside from the revolutionary in-game camera, by the time of its release, gamers were well accustomed to the Z-axis. Games like Resident Evil, Jumping Flash, Tekken 2, and Ridge Racer, remember that one? A majority of third-party developers, many of which had been with Nintendo exclusively for years, jumped ship. The main reason being Nintendo's insistence on sticking with the cartridge format, which not only made producing games more expensive, but had significantly less memory than a compact disc. It's kind of like your wife leaving you for a younger man who can store up to 650 megabytes and play full motion video at a higher resolution. At the dawn of the new millennium, when the dust had settled, Sony's PlayStation was the clear winner, outselling Nintendo by 69,560,000 units. Sony had successfully amassed 47% control of the industry, while Nintendo's share dropped by 57%. Following the flop that was the Virtual Boy, Nintendo needed to think outside the box for the next generation. I mean Cube, fuck! If the last generation of systems was about transitioning gameplay into the third dimension, then this generation was about who can sell the most DVD players. And Sony won. By a lot. The PlayStation 2 could read DVDs, music CDs, and was backwards compatible with the system that had an install base of well over 100 million potential customers. This gave Sony a broader commercial appeal than ever before, easily outselling Nintendo's Gamecube by 133 million units. Every console has a standout launch title showcasing their system's capabilities. The PlayStation 2 had Armored Core, the Xbox had Halo Combat Evolved, and the Gamecube had Luigi's Mansion. Announced at E3 2001, Luigi's Mansion was described as, quote, next in the Mario series. From the very beginning, the title faced a seemingly impossible uphill battle between its fierce competitors and following up to the monumental title that was Super Mario 64. Luigi's Mansion had to bear the weight of the world on its shoulders, because not only did it need to be a great game, it needed to convince consumers that Nintendo's GameCube was a worthwhile investment this generation. The end result was not just a great game, but a great showcase for the GameCube's capabilities, more so than any other launch title that generation. You can't overlook the system when discussing the game, because it had a great deal of influence on the overall design. Development began on the discontinued Nintendo 64 add-on, the disk drive. Originally planned to have players explore an apartment-like complex, the idea from the very beginning was to emulate the feeling of peeking into a dollhouse. This motif stuck around when development shifted focus to the GameCube, or as it was known at the time, Project Dolphin. One of the earliest titles developed for the new system, the developers made special requests to the hardware team to better suit their needs. This included adding a second analog stick to simultaneously control the character and their vacuum. This was long before the decision was made to have Luigi become the main protagonist in a not-so-scary game. As soon as Luigi reluctantly walks through the mansion's front doors and turns on his flashlight, the GameCube's power is on full display. It isn't as exciting as Mario jumping out of a pipe into a brand new 3D environment, but it serves the same purpose. Whether it's the dust in the air, the flashlight casting real-time shadows, or the physics of Luigi's nose, one thing's for certain, this could not have been achieved on previous hardware. Of course, a game's mark of quality isn't just how it looks, it's about how the player is able to interact with the world around them, and Nintendo knows this better than their competition. Many still consider the GameCube's controller to be one of the best designed, and it certainly wasn't an easy process getting there. The 64's controller is notorious for its odd shape and button placements. Controlling a character in a 3D space was a brand new challenge in the industry, and no company got it right their first time. Give Nintendo some credit, as they are the only console manufacturer willing to experiment and innovate with each generation. The goal when designing the controller was to optimize the player's ability to locate the buttons immediately without having to break the immersion from gameplay. Having learned from their previous mistakes, the GameCube's controller was designed to be as simple to use as possible. Each button has a unique shape. The C-stick is much more streamlined than the 64's C buttons. The D-pad shares the same design as the Game Boy Advance, and the shoulder buttons are now pressure sensitive. You can't really tell through the video, but they feel really nice. Luigi's Mansion made great use of the right shoulder button. When vacuuming ghosts, holding the button down all the way will give you maximum power. If you find yourself being dragged across the floor, your controller will vibrate, alerting you to pull the analog stick back the opposite direction. A feature pioneered by Nintendo, the controller has an integrated rumble motor that can be traced back to the 64's rumble pack. Although they might have been a factor in the GameCube's poor sales performance, the proprietary discs really did benefit games like Luigi's Mansion. Standing at 3 inches and able to store up to 1.5 gigabytes, the discs had the fastest loading times of that generation. The system's processor was able to work together with the disk drive to optimize disk reading. The result was no loading screens between areas. This is perhaps the game's strongest advantage, as the mansion's decrepit atmosphere begs for uninterrupted exploration. Is there a silence mode on this thing? In Super Mario 64, as soon as Mario enters through the castle's front doors, you are given the freedom to go wherever and do whatever you want. At a time where 3D games were brand new, this was essential to build players' confidence in their abilities to navigate through a 3D environment. A generation later, that same freedom might not appear in Luigi's Mansion, but the trade-off is a much more tailored experience. As video games became more complex, so did the stories and experiences developers intended for their audience. In Mario 64, you're an invited guest, but in Luigi's Mansion, you're a victim of fraud. You must carefully navigate a hostile environment that constantly reminds you you're not welcome here. Another important distinction this game makes is you are not controlling Super Mario, you are controlling Luigi, the younger, timid brother. Otherwise known as Player 2, Luigi has been living under his brother's shadow for as long as the two have appeared on screen. Naturally, this makes him the perfect candidate to receive his own game. I don't think an in-game 3D model up to this point was able to emote as well as Luigi is here. We take a lot of these technologies for granted now, but keep in mind the last time we saw Luigi's 3D model was in Mario Tennis. This was the video game equivalent to the fucking moon landing. Luigi is able to convey a believable sense of emotion that varies depending on the situation. In the dark, he trembles in fear, but in parts of the mansion you restore power, he calmly strolls while whistling the game's theme song. The portrait ghosts showcase a lot of personality as well, and although their backstories are a bit vague, what is left unsaid is better left to the imagination. In order to capture them, you first need to survey the environment and find a way to use it to your advantage. Sometimes that might be as simple as knocking a punching bag into a bodybuilder ghost, or maybe not as obvious, like pulling back a curtain to bring in a cold draft. The puzzles you'll encounter much later in the game require a different level of intuition when you unlock the elemental powers, fire, ice, and water. Unfortunately, every new mechanic the game introduces is hardly ever used in any meaningful ways, outside of a few rooms and enemies. This pad that switches gravity, for instance, is only used in 2 rooms, which begs the question, why even bother keeping it in the game? The most you'll get out of using your elemental powers is watering plants you find around the mansion. The total amount you earn will determine how large your mansion will become at the end, and granted if you can afford the property tax. Every room you explore has a unique layout and distinct features that keep the players from getting lost. As memorable as each portrait ghost encounter is, the impact of their presence surely would be diminished if the rooms were not just as memorable. There are, of course, supernatural elements as well that keep the overall experience from becoming stale. As for the common ghost types, there are plenty of variations, each requiring a different mode for attacking. The game prevents itself from falling victim to its own design by adding these unique variables to the albeit predictable formula. Further breaking the cycle are the bosses that make their appearance at the end of each major area of the mansion. They're all fought in a similar arena-like area. Their patterns are easy to recognize and don't impose a serious challenge. Besides the final boss, the most memorable encounter is against Bluesky, simply because it's the only boss that requires the use of an elemental power to be defeated. With only 4 major bosses, the game doesn't overstay its welcome and makes for a short but memorable experience. I finished the game around the 4-hour mark, and a quarter of that time was dedicated to capturing the 50 hidden boos throughout the mansion. It appears this was added to pad out the already short runtime, and it just hurts the overall experience. There's nothing unique about these encounters, and they all play out the same. As you progress throughout the campaign, their health increases, becoming an even greater nuisance than they already were. The pulling and dragging mechanic is completely tossed out the window in favor of a soft lock, where you hardly feel confident in your vacuum's ability to suck. Dragging out the already tired experience even further is their ability to leave in and out of rooms. When people fondly remember this game, I doubt they recall the amount of time dedicated to capturing boos. You are required to capture at least 40 before proceeding to the final boss. If every encounter is a minute long, then that would mean almost an hour is spent doing the same thing over and over again in an already short game. Upon its release, the game was met with favorable reviews, but critics felt the experience was far too short to compete with Nintendo's previous launch title, Super Mario 64. It seemed fitting that Luigi's first solo outing was overshadowed by Mario's success, and although there is a loose continuity tying these two together, Mario 64 will always have a much broader appeal. Compared to Luigi's Mansion, one is a playground and the other is an escape room, filled with ghosts. Luigi's Mansion would later receive a remake on the Nintendo 3DS. Arguably a D-make, the handheld's hardware was far too underpowered to run the game effectively. They got rid of a lot of the original's charm. The dust in the air is missing. The real-time shadows are noticeably worse, and Luigi's nose no longer has dedicated physics. Aside from the downgraded visuals, the game was originally designed with 2 analog sticks in mind, which the 3DS lacked. These omissions made the overall experience feel like a compromised remake. Nintendo's efforts remaking this title would have been better suited for their handheld console hybrid, the Switch, which had been out for a year at this point. The handheld was ultimately chosen because the developers had access to the sequel, Dark Moon's engine. It also satisfied a long-time experiment the team tinkered with way back on the Gamecube. The developers experimented with glasses-free 3D to convey each room's perceived depth. The invisible fourth wall we experienced the game through was the only artifact from those initial experiments that survived. I've heard this game described as baby's first survival horror, and I can't think of a better description. It certainly has its challenging moments, but overall it is a very linear experience. Those looking for a serious challenge can look forward to unlocking the Hidden Mansion, a second playthrough of the game where enemies are much harder to defeat and damage is doubled. The game shares a few similarities with titles like Resident Evil, and it's fun to draw comparisons between the two, although the atmosphere feels a lot more like Disney's Haunted Mansion and less like Silent Hill. The only thing that's missing from the experience that I would have enjoyed seeing is a stalker enemy, and maybe implementing an in-game time limit like it was originally planned to have. There's a common quote falsely attributed to the game's producer Shigeru Miyamoto that says, "A delayed game is eventually good, but a rushed game is forever bad." In the case of Luigi's Mansion, I would argue it is a very enjoyable experience, but there are a few noticeable areas and mechanics that leave a lot to be desired. The developers probably did their best to ensure the game was able to be shipped alongside the new system, but in order to meet the deadline, some content needed to be cut. By the time of the GameCube's release, the PlayStation 2 had already been out for a year, and its library had over 100 titles. Not wanting to repeat the same mistakes as last generation, Nintendo was likely feeling the pressure to rush development on all first-party titles. This included the true follow-up to Mario 64, Super Mario Sunshine, which didn't take the world by storm like Nintendo had hoped. Its rushed development cycle contributed to some of the more frustrating aspects of the game, preventing it from surpassing Mario 64 in sheer quality. It's a long way down from the top, and for the first time Nintendo found itself at its most vulnerable. This generation saw them go after the older demographic that Sony had captured the previous generation. Nintendo focused on making titles that appealed to all demographics. Each of their IPs were given new installments, new franchises blossomed into fan favorites, and third parties were bribed into exclusive contracts. But it just wasn't enough to drive players away from their competitors. For Nintendo, third place signified the changing tides in the industry, and if they wanted to remain profitable, they would have to go after a more casual demographic and leave the hardcore gamers to their competition. Luigi's Mansion was not the system seller that Nintendo might have anticipated, but in terms of launch titles, it ranks as one of the more memorable experiences. Not only did it showcase the GameCube's hardware, it was the perfect thesis for what that console represented. Like Luigi, it's often overlooked for its flaws, seen as underpowered when compared to its competition, but you ask anyone which of the Mario brothers they prefer, 9 out of 10 times, they'll answer correctly.
I'm Luigi, number 1.
My favorite memory of this game was playing it one night many Halloweens ago with my best friend and his younger cousin. I had lied to them saying I finished the game, when in actuality I was stuck somewhere in the second area. When his cousin invited us back to his place, he asked if I could help him beat it. I was shocked to find that he was much further ahead than I ever was. I don't remember exactly what excuse I used, but regardless, it remains my most cherished memory involving this game. If you happen to be watching this, and you know who you are, I'm sorry. I really am.
Mamma mia.
okay, Luigi?
That's Mama Luigi to you, Mario.
Bye. Have a beautiful time.